It's time for my top 10 waiver wire stashes ahead of week 11. Finally, we get a little bit of a break here on the bye weeks. Just two teams on a bye, the Saints and the Colts. So this week's waiver wire stash list is a little bit more nuanced and focused on injuries and potential risers and backfields. As always, you know the drill. Our goal here is to get ahead of the game and get a jump on your league mates. We are predicting which players could be top waiver wire ads on Tuesday, so that you can snag them now for free and you don't have to spend your FAAB or your waiver wire priority to get them. Let's beat the waiver wire together. It is week 10, and we literally have not seen Bucky Irving since week 4. It has been a nightmare for fantasy managers everywhere with zero timeline, zero details, and zero expectations around his return. And at this point, he hasn't practiced at all. It's not as if he's limited, he's not on the field, he doesn't appear to be relatively close to returning. Then to make matters worse, we actually did get a timeline on Chris Godwin. The timeline for him is late November, early December. So to get information on Godwin without any actual timeline around Bucky Irving is kind of crazy. So at this point, you need to operate under the assumption that you are moving forward without Irving for the foreseeable future. Tampa Bay is coming off a bye week, but in week 8, we saw a noticeable uptick in snaps and touches for Sean Tucker. We saw the version of Rachaad White that lost his job to Bucky Irving in 2024, the ineffective, inefficient version of Rachaad White that struggles to produce on the ground. Tucker, on the other hand, had a fine day. He had 12 carries for 42 yards and a touchdown. We were willing to forego the clear ineffectiveness of Rachaad White on the ground because of his receiving upside and the amount of touches that he was getting. But Tucker outperforming him is a wee bit of an issue because this offense has zero problem operating in a committee. That is exactly what we saw last year until they finally committed to Bucky Irving over Rachaad White. So I would not be shocked to see a more even split between White and Tucker moving forward. And again, running back is very ugly this week at this point in the season once you get past the top 24s. So Tucker is definitely worth a stash here. We talked about this in the waiver wire video. The Jags are thin at receiver, and even though they went out and got Jakobi Meyers, which I do think is good for their team, both Travis Hunter and Brian Thomas Jr. are out, and that is a major blow to their offense. The Jags could easily just lean on their running backs to help them get over these injuries. In week 9, Travis Etienne had a fine day, and adding Bhayshul Tuten is not about trying to anticipate some kind of backfield takeover here. But we did see an increase in usage in Bhayshul Tuten this week. Now, there was not an increase in snaps. We need to be very clear on that. Travis Etienne still played over 50% of snaps, and Bhayshul Tuten just hovered around 25%. But Tuten's actual touches literally doubled from what they had been in each of the past 4 games. That is not a coincidence there. And they were not meaningless touches. They were high-value touches, and he did get a touchdown. And again, with all of these injuries that are happening, they're going to have to lean on the run. The run game has generally been down lately prior to this game, but I talked about that before. It's just because they have been in absolutely terrible matchups. So don't look at the lack of efficiency of either back and be overly critical here. Now, this week's matchup is also terrible. Not going to lie there. But they have got much better matchups coming up right after this, and if Tuten has a strong performance, you will be glad that you stashed him. Cedric Tillman is set to return from IR. Now, don't get too excited. Dillon Gabriel clearly still isn't going anywhere, and Gabriel has been absolutely horrific for the Browns receivers in general. It's not as if the Browns receivers were actually thriving with Joe Flacco earlier in the season, but we've seen Joe Flacco move on and thrive in Cincinnati. So perhaps I shouldn't place all the blame on Dillon Gabriel. Perhaps it's just a function of Kevin Stefanski's offense right now. But regardless, we have not seen any of the Browns receivers thrive without Gabriel. However, when it comes to Cedric Tillman, we might have a glimmer of hope here, because he was actually outperforming Jerry Jeudy earlier in the season. And in his very short early season production here, we did see promise. Now, technically speaking, if you want to roster a Browns receiver, and I know you probably don't want to, but if you do want to, it should be Tillman over Jeudy. He had 7 receptions on 15 targets and 2 touchdowns in the first 2 weeks of the season. And we really haven't seen Tillman for an extended period of time as a starter in his very young career here. But from the small sample size that we do have, we know he is extremely talented. If given somewhat accurate targets, he can succeed here. Tillman is worth stashing just to see if he builds a stronger rapport with Dillon Gabriel than Jerry Jeudy has. Saquon Barkley is fine. There's no issue here. He was cleared. He practiced in full. There was no lingering problem out of the bye week there with the injury that he had in the prior week. But at this point in the season, we want to start looking at high-end handcuffs and stashing them in case something happens to the lead back. Then we're not fighting with everyone else on the waiver wires. We've already got our league-winning running back on roster. And quite frankly, I do think that's exactly what Tank Bigsby can be here. We last saw the Eagles in week 8, and the run game finally got back on track. Saquon Barkley had an excellent day with 150 yards on the ground. And in relief of that injured Saquon Barkley, Tank Bigsby had 9 carries for 104 yards. Bigsby had a lot of hype this offseason, and I'm still not entirely sure how Bigsby went from taking first-team reps with the Jags to getting shipped off to Philly, but it was good to see him showcase exactly what we saw this offseason and show that he's the clear and direct handcuff to Saquon Barkley and would have extreme upside if Barkley were to go down with an injury again. We talked about this in the start-sit video. Tyrone Tracy Jr. is very high rostered, and Devin Singletary is still readily available on waivers despite outperforming Tyrone Tracy last week. Now, Tracy is also significantly higher ranked this week, and fantasy analysts and managers are really still holding out hope here that last week was just some kind of weird blip and that Tracy is really the lead back here. Ultimately, I truly believe that this is a committee and that the goal line preference will go to Singletary, so it does give him a slight edge, but really, technically speaking, the goal line preference is actually really Jackson Dart. But still, I get why people prefer to roster Tracy over Singletary. Tracy did outperform him all season long. You've got a full season of evidence of that. And we know that his upside is significant, but he wouldn't be the first day 3 running back that disappeared into the abyss after a very strong rookie season, so keep that in mind. Again, Singletary was the more effective back in week 9. Tracy had 5 carries for 18 yards and 3 receptions on 4 targets for 19 yards, while Singletary had 8 carries for 43 yards and 2 receptions on 2 targets for 8 yards. Singletary, again, also outsnapped Tracy, and Singletary, again, was the preferred goal line back. This is definitely a fairly good matchup here, and if the Giants are able to keep this game close, which is a very good possibility here purely based on Jackson Dart, I wouldn't be shocked if we get another solid performance from Singletary. So Ramondre Stevenson is out again this week, and remember, the injury is a toe injury. You know how those toes go. Those injuries tend to linger and can often be multi-week injuries, as you have seen by yet another Brock Purdy absence. So TreVeyon Henderson is definitely the lead back here in Stevenson's absence. That much is very clear. Henderson in the last game had 14 carries for 55 yards and 4 receptions on 6 targets for 32 yards. But Terrell Jennings was very much involved. Now, let's be clear, the snaps were not even close. Henderson was definitely operating as the lead back here, but the usage specifically was giving a little bit of a mini committee here. Jennings had 11 carries. 11 is very close to 14 for 35 yards, and he also got a touchdown and had a reception for 1 yard. Now, I would expect Jennings to remain relevant in a little bit of a committee here, potentially with Henderson, and if Jennings can gain just a little bit of preference at the goal line, that is definitely someone that we want to roster. Like, we literally have people that are out here starting a running back that has not had literally more than 5 points in a legit month. Yes, Ja'Cory Krosky-Merritt, I am looking at you, man. So if Jennings can actually be productive with his touches, I don't care if he's on the field for 20% of snaps. Don't be shocked if he is potentially a popular ad this week if he has another solid performance. Now, this one is interesting in terms of how we approach this. If you remember the waiver wire video, you might be a little confused because I definitely listed Kayshon Boutte on that video and not Kyle Williams. But there is a logical reason for that. If you need an actual starter, the correct move is Demario Douglas here. His snaps were extremely low, but that's been the case all season. He does have a great existing rapport with Drake May, and he is a key red zone target for Drake May as well. So with Kayshon Boutte out, he is a valid streaming option. Now, Kyle Williams, I would not start Kyle Williams, but I would potentially stash him here. Demario Douglas was again the person who led the way last week with 4 receptions on 6 targets for 100 yards and a touchdown. But Douglas didn't actually see an increase in snaps with the injury to Kayshon Boutte, and that is because they do not play the same role. So it should not affect him. Williams actually outsnapped Douglas, but he just wasn't productive and he only had 1 target. We got to remember that he is a rookie and he hasn't been on the field much, but the Patriots likely planned this week to be without Kayshon Boutte and probably plan to more directly integrate Williams into the game plan this week. I wouldn't feel comfortable starting him, again, but he is worth a stash in deeper leagues to see if he gets more targets this week. Kayshon Boutte didn't seem close to returning this week, and hamstrings are often multi-week injuries, so Williams could have relevance next week against a Jets defense that literally just sold off half their squad. Tucker Kraft is unfortunately out for the season with a torn ACL, which is a massive blow to the Packers offense, an offense that heavily relied on him this season. Romeo Doubs has been an adequate wide receiver one. Christian Watson returned. He's looked good. That's cool. And at some point, it's looking like maybe over the next couple of weeks, maybe we will get Jaden Reed back. But Tucker Kraft has been the most constant presence in the Packers receiving core, in their passing offense there. Now, prior to last week, the Packers' target distribution was 42 targets to Romeo Doubs and 41 targets to Tucker Kraft, and Matthew Golden coming in third at 26. Kraft has had 6 touchdowns on the season, and they definitely have to fill that hole in the offense. Now, usually, often when a starting tight end goes down, we don't feel super comfortable turning to the backup. Sometimes we do. Sometimes it ends up working out. But in this case, the backup, Luke Musgrave, is a tight end that was ironically drafted in the same draft and actually taken before Tucker Kraft. Musgrave is a fine tight end. He is not Tucker Kraft, right? Tucker Kraft beat him out because he is simply better, and that was very evident on the field. Still, the Packers have to fill this hole in the offense. The tight end still has to get targets, and the tight end one there will be Luke Musgrave. I wouldn't expect the same upside that Tucker Kraft had, but Musgrave could potentially be a borderline tight end one. Now, this stash, I won't lie, it is potentially an underwhelming one, but as I mentioned previously, considering that, again, there are fantasy managers out there starting running backs who have not scored more than 5 fantasy points in a legitimate month, it is absolutely worth looking at rostering and stashing Devin Neal. Now, we haven't seen a ton of Neal as he was playing behind both Alvin Kamara and Kendre Miller, and he only came into relevance after Miller's injury. From the tiny usage we have seen, we do know that he can handle work on the ground and through the air. It's a very minuscule sample size that we have. Now, the Saints offense is definitely a mess right now. This matchup with Carolina isn't ideal. Though the Panthers have struggled over the past couple of weeks, they still have made a noticeable jump from their 2024 version. But a lead back is a lead back, and if Alvin Kamara's injury keeps him out this week or potentially lingers here, Devin Neal could technically be the lead back. This isn't a critical stash since the Saints are on a bye week next week, but given that the team is going absolutely nowhere and that Kamara has been wildly unproductive, and the fact that he has been barely utilized, and the fact that he has been playing through this injury here, I would not be surprised if they give him some potentially extended rest here. That would put Neal in a position to potentially become a priority waiver wire ad. Now, this is a speculative stash since I filmed this video on Friday night and posted on Saturday morning. So at this point, I don't technically know if Adonai Mitchell will actually even play this week. This stash is more geared towards very deep leagues. I would not recommend this in shallow formats. But if the Jets announce that Mitchell will play this week, he is definitely worth a stash in deeper leagues. Beyond Garrett Wilson, there is no consistent wide receiver 2 in the Jets offense. With Justin Fields at quarterback, technically speaking, that wide receiver 2 spot might not be significantly relevant there, but I am intrigued to see Mitchell away from the Colts. He flashed during the offseason, he showed promise, but he is clearly always the odd man out in the Indianapolis receiving core. In a thinner wide receiver group somewhere else, Mitchell could become relevant there. Realistically, he was never going to see playing time over Michael Pittman, Josh Downs, and Alec Pierce. And then once Tyler Warren entered the mix there just wasn't really space for him. So getting out of that organization is going to be the best opportunity that he's had thus far. I am actually very intrigued to see him outside of the Colts. And friendly reminder there, if these guys are available on your roster, absolutely stash and add them. Now again, these guys are a little bit higher roster than the other guys we talked about. Parker Washington, one, again, we talked about the Jags receiving core there, all of the injuries. Parker Washington does have the opportunity to step up there and garner a significant amount of targets there. And then Tez Johnson, again, for Tampa Bay. We talked about Chris Godwin, the injury timeline for him, late November, early December. Tez is clearly the wide receiver 2 there for an extended period of time. So he is definitely worth a roster. Thank you so much for tuning in. If you enjoyed the video, be sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel. You can find me across all social media platforms at It's Terra Time, so make sure that you're tuned in because I'm bringing you more fantasy football content all season long. Every week I've got you covered with waiver wire ads, stashes, live shows where you can ask me live Q&A, and so much more.